Is the image in Sākārajñānavāda unreal?
K. Kataoka. This paper addresses a perplexing statement by Kamalasila concerning the nature of images, akara, in Sākārajñānavāda. Kamalasila, in his comparative description of the Sākārajñānavāda position of cognition without images, and the Sākārajñānavāda position of cognition with images, surprisingly asserts the unreality, asatyatva, of the various images present in a single cognition when discussing the latter. He explicitly denies that these images are ultimately real, paramarthika. Funayama, 2007, highlights this admission by Kamalasila that, within the Sākārajñānavāda, the images are unreal, posing a significant problem. The problematic statement from Kamalasila is as follows.
TSP ad 3626 1125,8, 10 corrected in part following Funayama 2007, 196, na ākārām asatietvāt. Yadihi ekasie pāramārthika ākārā bhavēju, tadā siād ekasie vicitratva virodha. Jāvatā satiebhūtā evākārā itiem.
No, because the images are unreal. For if there were ultimately real images in a single cognition, then there would be a contradiction in a single cognition being diverse. However, there is no contradiction, because it is admitted that the images are nothing but unreal. What exactly is the problem here? The primary issue is that this statement appears to be made from the perspective of what is commonly understood as Sākārajñānavāda, the doctrine of real images. It would seem a clear contradiction for proponents of real images to declare images unreal. Consequently, Funayama questions our conventional understanding that equates Kamalasila's position of cognition with images with the commonly accepted doctrine of real images, Funayama 2007, 190, 197, 199. In essence, he challenges the appropriateness of projecting later conventional understandings onto Kamalasila. The crucial question, then, is whether Kamalasila's Sākārajñānavāda indeed differs from the conventional Sākārajñānavāda, as Funayama suggests. Classification of theories of images. Before examining Kamalasila's description, let's reconfirm our conventional understanding. Traditionally, several basic positions on the theory of images can be categorized as follows. Nirakaravada, doctrine of no images Nyaya, MMA with Macron essay with Macron. Sākārajñānavāda, doctrine of images Yogacara, Sautrantika. 2.1 Alakakaravada, doctrine of false images, equals Nirakaṛajñāvāda, position of cognition without images. 2.2 Satyakaravada, doctrine of real images, equals Sākārajñāvāda, position of cognition with images. While Nyaya and MMA with Macron essay with Macron acknowledge images in the external world, they do not admit them in cognition. In contrast, the Yogacara and Sautrantika schools admit images in cognition. Furthermore, this Sākārajñānavāda within Buddhism is divided into two, Alakakaravada and Satyakaravada. In Kamalasila's own terminology, the former is the position of cognition without images, and the latter is the position of cognition with images. Kamalasila's statement above appears within the discussion of the Omniscient One. It is situated in the context where Tarakita addresses the question raised by Sma and Yaja, TS 3247a, regarding whether the Buddha, as the Omniscient One, cognizes everything simultaneously or sequentially, and their argument, TS 3248, that it's impossible for a single cognition to simultaneously cognize all contradictory things, such as purity and impurity. Tarakita, in contrast, argues that it is possible to cognize all contradictory things simultaneously with a single cognition, TS 3621-3626. Kamalasila elaborates that for both positions within Buddhism, there is no problem whatsoever in cognizing an infinite multitude simultaneously. The aforementioned statement emerged from his discussion of how, from the perspective of Sākārajñānavāda, everything can be cognized simultaneously. Paramarthika, ultimately real, equals satya, true/real. First, we must note the meaning of real, satya, here. Kamalasila rephrases it as ultimately real, paramarthika. The expression a single cognition, being diverse is a contradiction, ekajya visitratva viroda, also draws our attention. This phrase evokes Dharmakirti's well-known theory of Satradvaita, diverse yet non-dual. The immediate association with both the theory of non-duality of variety and ultimate reality brings to mind Dharmakirti's following statement. PB 3:2 Tenab, ki sayatsa sitratakasi, na sayatasi madhav API/. What fault would there be if that diversity were in a single cognition, and by that cognition, the diversity of its external object was established? However, ultimately, there would be no diversity, even in that cognition. Cf. Tosaki 1979, 310. Kamalasila's statement that a single cognition, being diverse is a contradiction thus aligns with PV3:2 Tanab, where Tarmakirti denies the diversity, Citrata, of a single cognition from the ultimate perspective, Tosaki 1979, 310. This implies a negation of the object of apprehension, Graya, by first negating diversity from the wise one's emptiness perspective that negates everything, Tosaki 1979, 309, rather than the conventional standpoint of Sākārajñānavāda upheld by Sākārajñānavāda.
The conventional nature of Sākārajñānavāda is further confirmed by Gnanasrimitra. JNA with Macron 461.20, Tena Sākārajñānavāda Saphiosiate. Paramathata Punar Advaittam Eva.
Therefore, diversity is also spoken of conventionally.
However, ultimately, there is only non-duality.
Furthermore, Oki, 1975, discusses in detail how Gnanasrimitra's understanding is based on Prajnakaragupta.
Considering the above, Kamalasila's statement that the images are unreal can be understood in the context of denying the diversity of cognition from the Yogacara ultimate perspective.
Satya, true/real, versus Alika, false/unreal. Next, let's examine how real, Satya, in real images contrasts with false, Alika, in false images.
Consider the following passage. JNA with Macron 405.19-20, Napi Alikatvame with Macron K with Macronare with Macrona with Macronim, Artha Samarthayasya Samartha Tatpat. Nor are the images false, because their functional efficacy has been established.
Here, Gnanasrimitra argues against the falsity of images by citing their functional efficacy. Conversely, this implies that he considers images to possess functional efficacy, meaning they are existent, sat, and are unique particulars, svalaka.
This is the substance of not being false, i.e., being real for him.
Akara, Arthakriya Samartha equals sat equals svalaka equals analika equals satya. The fact that images within cognition are unique particulars in Sākārajñānavāda is also a premise for critique by Dharmadhara, a proponent of Nirakarajñāvāda, who himself, in his Apahapracara, believes that what is non-existent, i.e., fabricated, is the object of conceptual cognition. Frauwallner 1937, 238.21.
Does Pamed Paranam Par Artog Pa Yolin? Frauwallner 1937, 241.2-6.
Fire Giltar Bieloeg Zugsbernanin /Artog G Rig Par Jungshan Giezig Las Sen Sel Ba Scried on du Bertag Zinez Artog Pamed Pi Elia Scried on du Leg Par Zen Pi Spud Adamidad Pi Fire Zugsbernan Raji Imshen Nid Emia Scriberjad Byrios Subertags Par Giltar Gyre T / Therefore, how could it be a reflection in cognition? The wise one, for some reason, postulates exclusion from others as the meaning of a word, and then, how would he consider a reflection, which is a particular, svalaka, even though it is not different from cognition, as the referent of a word, even though it is the object of non-conceptual cognition and yet mistaken for the object of a word?
Japanese translation by Kataoka 2016, 63, German translation in Frauwallner 1937, 262.
Expanding on this passage by Dharmadhara, Sukarita Misra states,
Katha Punarajñānakaro Bilpasasargayogia. Say hi Vikal Pajnanat Ananyas Tadvat Eva Kaiko Shra Iti Suktas Vasavidivad Avyaya Sabdanam.
Kataoka 2014, 325, 28-324, 39. Then how can the image of cognition, itself, be capable of being associated with verbal expression? For since it, the image of cognition, is not different from conceptual cognition, it is, just like conceptual cognition, momentary and non-common, unique, and thus, like the self-awareness of pleasure, etc., it is not an object of words.
Japanese translation by Kataoka 2016, 87.
Dharmadhara points out that, for the opponent's view, the image within cognition, being non-different from conceptual cognition, would become a unique particular, svalaka, just like conceptual cognition itself. Ratnakarasanti, after defining the three natures, Swabhava Parakalpada, imagined, Paratantra, dependent, and Paranapana, perfected, correlates them with Prajnaptasat, existent by designation, Dravyasat, substantially existent, and Paramarthasat, ultimately existent, respectively, Umano 2002, 214. The Paratantra, which is substantially existent, corresponds to Abhuta Parakalpa, imagination of a non-existent, whose essence is the mind and mental factors of the three realms, Umano 2002, 215. In Sākārajñānavāda, since images are not distinct from cognition, they should be located here as unique particulars.
Paranapana equals Paramarthasat. Paratantra equals Dravyasat equals Abhuta Parakalpa equals Siddhikata. Parakalpada equals Prajnaptasat equals Samarapada equals Alika.
Therefore, for Ratnakarasanti, who considers images to be false, Alika, the statement that images are not real but false must mean that they are not substantially existent but existent by designation.
Ratnakarasanti explicitly states that Alika, false, Dvitava, untrue, and Brantisamarapada, fabricated by error, are synonyms, refer to Luo Hong's critical edition of PPU. The corresponding passage in Umano 2002, 265.3 is a mistranslation. It is self-evident that Samarapada is a synonym, or an interpretation, of Kalpita. Consequently, the real in the opposing Satyakaravada must correspond to Dravyasat, substantially existent, not Paramarthasat, ultimately existent. That is, real when speaking of real images means being a paratantra unique particular. Conversely, false when speaking of false images means not being a paratantra unique particular, but a prajnaptasat fabricated by conceptual construction. It is crucial to note that the point of contention is not whether something is ultimately existent, paramarthasat. For example, in the following usage, the real used by Kamalasila should be interpreted at the level of substantial existence. BHK 7.1-2, Yada Hyal Kasva Bivarti Kropagrahia Siddham Eva Siddharkra Pratibasate, Tadasayapi Rupadavat Tadavyatarakat Satyatva Kutra, Bhavat. For if, by grasping the color/form image, etc., which have a false nature, the mind itself appears as diverse, then how could this, mind, also be real, since it is not different from color/form, etc., just like color/form, etc.? Similar to the previous example, here too, the conclusion is drawn based on the identity of the images and the mind. While it was previously stated, in accordance with Sākārajñānavāda, that the mind, cognition, is a unique particular, and therefore the images, being identical to it, are also unique particulars, here, conversely, it is pointed out, from the Madhyamaka perspective, that if the images are false, then the mind, being identical to them, also becomes false and unreal. This understanding aligns with Moriyama, 1993, who discusses various sources based on Bodhibhadra's view that, in the doctrine of real images, images are considered to be of the paratantra nature, while in the doctrine of false images, images are considered to be of the parakalpita nature. The intent of Kamalasila's statement. Revisiting Kamalasila's description, the particular problem highlighted was the contradiction of a single cognition having diverse images. That is, when Kamalasila stated, for if there were ultimately real images in a single cognition, then there would be a contradiction in a single cognition, being diverse. The issue was the impossibility of ultimately real images in a single cognition, and the contradiction of a single entity being diverse. Here, he says the images are unreal because the diversity, visitratva, of a single cognition contradicts the one versus many principle. He is negating the Satradvaita model from the ultimate perspective. Therefore, when Kamalasila stated, because the images are unreal, what he had in mind was the negation of Satradvaita from the ultimate perspective, as seen in Tarmakiri, and the specific Sākārajñānavāda equals Satyakaravada position of the Yogacara school, i.e., excluding the Sautrantika, that leads to the means of entering the signless, asalaka, state, which transcends the duality of apprehended and apprehending. It should not be associated with Alakakaravada. The level of Satya, true/real, and Paramarthika, ultimately real. It is important to note again the level of real, satya, and ultimately real, paramarthika, as used by Kamalasila. According to Ratnakarasanti, the three natures, svabhava, of Yogacara, parinapana, paratantra, parakalpita, can be rephrased as paramarthasat, dravyasat, and prajnaptasat, respectively. Therefore, the statement that diverse images are unreal, asatyatva, and not ultimately real, aparamarthika, can be interpreted as meaning that they are substantially existent, dravyasat, but not ultimately existent, paramarthasat. As Moriyama, 1993, organized, the opposition between real images and false images is an opposition between images being substantially existent, paratantra, or existent by designation, parakalpita, not an opposition between being ultimate or not. 1. Parinapana. Paramarthasat. Ultimate/real. 2. Paratantra. Dravyasat. Real. Not ultimate/not real. 3. Parakalpita. Prajnaptasat. False. Kamalasila's statement of unreality can be interpreted in line with the Yogacara model of real images. That is, the statement, diverse images are unreal can be reinterpreted as diverse images, which are identified with cognition at the level of substantial existence, from the Sautrantika perspective, are unreal from the ultimate perspective, of Yogacara Satyakaravada. If it were Alakakaravada, images would not even be substantially existent, so there would be no need to deny their ultimate existence in the first place. Conclusion. Kamalasila, in describing what he calls the position of cognition with images, explicitly states that images are unreal and not ultimately real. This statement can be reinterpreted as a negation of the Satradvaita, diverse yet non-dual, theory, common to both Sautrantika and Yogacara,
from the ultimate perspective of Yogacara, Sākārajñānavāda equals Satyakaravada. In other words, it does not refer to Alakakaravada. Therefore, there is no fundamental need to revise our existing understanding that real images equals cognition with images.
We can understand Kamalasila's statement within the existing framework.
The value of unreal can differ depending on whether the underlying opposition is understood as Parakalpita versus Paratantra or Paratantra versus Paranippana. Funayama, 2007, question can be resolved by considering this. Conversely, if we do not interpret it this way, we would be forced to equate Kamalasila's cognition with images with so-called false images, which would necessitate a significant change in our framework. In that case, as Funayama, 2007, was concerned, we would be unable to apply the oppositional structure between Ratnakarasanti and Nanasrimitra to earlier periods.
However, the schema of opposition between the two views within Yogacara, as Asathyati and Atmakyati, has already been clearly conceptualized by Manamara. This also lends support to our argument.